The second issue Farage is under investigation for is similar, the gifts from George Cottrell. Posh George is a central figure in the Farage entourage. On July the 5th, it was claimed by the Sunday Times he had provided security personnel and 3 people to manage Farage's social media. He also apparently paid rent for Farage to live in a plush £4 million London house, which Farage is still using. All of this appears to have been provided in the year prior to Farage becoming an MP. As the Sunday Times has it, the social media staff began to be hired in September 2023. The main employee, Jack Anderton, was paid £55,000 a year by Cottrell, and in June 2024 he was brought onto Reform's official payroll, £4,500 per video. The paper does not know when security began to be provided, but does know the last payment was made in the first quarter of 2024. Farage did declare one gift from Cottrell, £9,000 for a trip to a conference in Belgium, so it shows he realised gifts needed to be reported. Why he didn't mention the others is an interesting question. Montenegro-based Cottrell has been convicted of fraud in the United States, where a fake money laundering service was offered on the dark web and criminals were relieved of their ill-gotten gains. This adds an extra unsavoury complexion to the situation and has been another gift to the headline writers. Once again, it could be argued all of Cottrell's gifts should have been declared because they are linked to Farage being an MP and his political activities. In the case of the social media staff, you could especially say this. However, the same get-out is potentially there, that you could argue they didn't need to be declared because Farage didn't believe that they did. At the end of the day, it is up to the interpretation of the panel making the decision. Both Cottrell and Harborne's gifts could also be said to have contributed to Farage's election campaign in Clacton, as well as other reform campaigns. These may be things, depending on timing, that should have been declared to the Electoral Commission on his expenses return, which he may or may not have done, but that's another matter. Lastly, we have the much less serious accusation that Farage has not properly declared certain properties he owns. MPs are required to report all properties, with exceptions. Members must register land or property which they own or hold, either by themselves or with or on behalf of their spouse, parents, partner or dependent children, excluding property used wholly for the member's own personal residential purposes or those of their spouse, partner or dependent children. Farage and his partner are reported to own at least 5 homes worth £4 million in total. 2 in Folkestone and Tandridge have been declared. 1 in Clacton is owned by his partner and is supposedly the primary residence of Farage, so did not require reporting. Another is occupied by his daughter, which the rules also allow you not to declare. This is the one the Times printed a photograph of and sent journalists to, much to the chagrin of their target. The 5th house, Farage says, is owned by a company he controls, which he had already reported the total assets for. He didn't think, he claims, that he needed to mention the house separately. This all seems quite legitimate, and unless any other problematic properties turn up, it is unlikely this angle will come to anything. Although I do think Farage should have declared the Harborne and Cottrell gifts, we should point out that donations or gifts in exchange for favourable policies is the bread and butter of British politics. It is hardly a dirty secret. It is a known practice which politicians only attack when their rivals do it. In a twist of irony, considering it was the Tories who reported Farage, Harborne also donated £1 million to Boris Johnson in 2019. In what must have been a complete coincidence, a company which Harborne was the major shareholder of, Quinitech, later won a 2023 government defence contract worth £80 million. The renewable energy magnate, Dale Vince, famously gave vast amounts to Labour, whether the party, Starmer or individual Labour MPs, and has directly benefited from the government's energy policies and its zealous net zero programme. Vince also got planning permission for a solar farm approved by Ed Miliband. Lord Ali bought Starmer's designer gear, and the Labour benches had an epidemic of corporate gifts as they skipped into power like kids entering a sweet shop. Talking of epidemics, there were all sorts of funny goings-on during COVID. The construction industry was not hit by lockdowns when other sectors were, which some attributed to a lot of Tory donors being from that field. Serco got contracts to run test and trace during COVID, as it has been charged with all sorts of things from prisons to asylum hotels for decades. The huge firm is known to have connections to the Tory party, namely the brother of Nicholas Soames, who was the CEO from 2014 to 2023, and the MP Edward Argar, who was head of public affairs for the company. Such things have been commonplace since the dawn of politics, and continue despite the increased transparency and regulation. To single reform out as unique in this is unfair. Neither a reform alone in failing to declare things or file the correct paperwork. This happens as frequently as the conflicts of interest. Take, for example, the Labour Together scandal. Between 2015 and 2020, the pro-Starmer think tank failed to declare £739,000 in donations. This was despite them being fully aware, it seems, that they needed to do so. The excuse was that this was to protect the identity of its major donors from the ire of momentum. Politicians and political parties are flawed. The whole game of politics is based around favour, money, and industrial influence. It can never be extricated from these aspects, much as we might want it to be. There comes a point when you need to consider the greater good, and unless egregious breaking of the rules or a total betrayal occurs, one of the cynical rogues has to be backed. You do not back them because you believe they are saintly, but because they are a better option than the other guy, and the awful situation demands someone who will handle it better than the incumbent. You will risk the label of hypocrisy in search of your best interests. This is why Labour supporters continue to back their team, despite what seems to be extensive rule-breaking, rule-bending and corruption. Ditto for the SNP and everyone else. Farage may well have done wrong. He might have been made to look foolish by a grown man dressed as a dustbin. He might be compromised by money and whispers in his ears from dubious businessmen. But is it enough to discount him and reform as a way out of the dysfunctional horror show that has become our nation? I don't think so. And while being prepared to criticise reform, I am also well prepared to support them in lieu of the perfect in a mortal, complicated world.